Welcome, wherever you are and whatever may be lingering on your mind. Now is a good time to set it all aside. Let the world grow a little quieter. Let your breath settle into a steady rhythm, and allow your thoughts to drift slowly, gently, into the distant past. Tonight, we'll set sail, not on a pleasure cruise, nor with the bright fanfare of a postcard voyage. No, this journey will carry you across salted waters and into the forgotten corners of the age of exploration. A time of wooden ships and uncertain maps, of stars overhead and rot below deck. It was a period marked by ambition, conquest, and unspeakable hardship. Yet behind the grandeur and gold, there were men. Ordinary men, men who lived, labored, and died at sea. We begin with their world, the lower decks, the damp hammocks, the hunger, the storms. Then we'll follow the doomed voyage of Ferdinand Magellan, who set out to circumnavigate the globe, but never returned. Later, we'll sink with a forgotten shipwreck, long buried beneath centuries of sand and silt, one whose discovery changed how we understand early global trade. And finally, we'll step ashore, not with calloused hands, but with soft ones, into the glittering court of Lisbon, where gold, spice, and secrecy reshaped the elite. So now, get comfortable. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you. Let the creak of timber and the hiss of wind fade into the quiet of your room. And imagine yourself aboard a ship where adventure waited just beyond the horizon and misery lived just beneath your feet. Close your eyes if you haven't already. Now picture a wooden ship, not the gleaming kind from films, but a battered vessel, creaking, damp, and filled with the musk of unwashed men, wet rope, dried fish, and salt. The wood groans with every wave. The sails above you snap like thunder in the wind. Below deck, darkness clings to everything. Imagine yourself a sailor in the early 1500s. You're perhaps 22, though already worn to the bone. You signed on not out of a love for the sea, but out of necessity. Maybe your land was gone. Maybe your village offered nothing but hunger. Or perhaps you were fleeing something, a debt, a name, a family. No matter the reason, you're here now, and here is miserable. The smell and the suffering. The first thing you'd notice, day after day, is the smell. Salt, of course, but beneath that, deeper and darker, rotting wood from constant damp. The stink of sweat-soaked wool never washed. The acrid tang of pitch and tar used to plug the endless leaks. And always, the sour fermented stench of spoiled provisions, rancid salted meat, weevils in the biscuit barrel, brackish water crawling with algae. You slept, if you could call it that, in a hammock, or perhaps on a damp roll of canvas, if hammocks weren't yet available. Rats scurried over your legs as you dreamed of home. Or perhaps you didn't dream at all. The rocking of the ship made rest elusive. The groaning of timbers was a lullaby of stress. Every creak might mean a crack, and every storm might mean the end. You wore the same clothes for weeks, often months. There were no uniforms, just layers of wool, heavy linen, and coarse leather. Over time, they would stiffen with salt and sweat, becoming a second skin until they simply rotted away. The food and the fear meals were not moments of joy, but of grim necessity. Hardtack, biscuits so hard they might break your teeth, were your daily bread. Salted beef, long past its prime, was boiled into stews to mask its taste. Sometimes the stew included peas or lentils, but only sometimes. Often it included worms. They simply called them meat flies and learned to ignore them. And water, well, the barrel started fresh, but within weeks it would turn slimy. Green, sometimes you drank beer or wine instead. Not because it tasted good, but because it wouldn't kill you quite as quickly. Disease was the ship's constant companion, scurvy especially, caused by lack of fresh fruit and vegetables. Gums would swell, teeth would loosen, joints would ache. Skin would bruise with no cause. And finally, death would arrive not with drama, but with a quiet collapse. There was no doctor, only the surgeon, whose tools were crude and whose knowledge limited. If you needed something removed, a tooth, a finger, a limb, it was done swiftly and without mercy. Infection was common, recovery rare. The work and the weather every day, the same rhythm. You climbed rigging slick with spray and bird droppings. You hauled ropes heavier than yourself. You scrubbed the decks not with soap but with sand. Sand and seawater. The hope was to keep disease away. It didn't work, but the ritual continued. You navigated by stars if you were lucky enough to see them. Most couldn't read the stars. Only the officers could. You followed orders. You heaved. You bailed water. You patched sails in wind so sharp it cut your fingers. And the storms. Storms came without warning. One moment calm, the next a wall of water. No lightning bolts or cinematic crashes. Just endless grey and wind that howled like a wounded animal. You couldn't hear commands. You could only hold on. And when men went overboard, washed away by a wave or pulled by an errant rope, there was no rescue, no heroics. They vanished into the deep and you moved on. Perhaps someone murmured a prayer. But usually no one did. There wasn't time. Or perhaps there wasn't the will. The discipline and the despair discipline was brutal. A missed task, a disrespectful glance, a moment of disobedience. These could earn you the lash. The cat-o'-nine-tails was no myth. And the worst punishments weren't even violent. They were quiet isolation. Starvation, being tied to the mast in a storm. Or worse, being left ashore in foreign lands, alone. And all the while the destination was vague. Maps were unreliable. Latitude was measured, but longitude was still a mystery. You were always, in some sense, lost. But there were moments of quiet beauty. A pod of dolphins following the ship. A warm breeze after weeks of chill. The soft slosh of water against the hull in the still of night. These were rare but real. Moments that made men believe, for a fleeting instant, that the world was wider than their suffering. Yet for most, the voyage ended not in glory but in illness or in silence. Few sailors returned rich. And now, as we drift gently forward, let us leave the creaking hull behind and follow the wake of a man who dared to cross the entire world but never made it home. Imagine now the soft hush of early morning on a European harbour. The sky is dim, not yet blue, and the air is thick with the scent of brine, pitch, and wet rope. You hear the faint calls of gulls, the hollow slap of waves against hulls, the slow creaking of moored ships readying for departure. You're standing on the docks of Seville, and the year is 1519. A small fleet is preparing to sail. 5 ships, none particularly large, none especially new. Yet this departure would mark the beginning of one of the most ambitious voyages in human history. And at the center of it all, a quiet, rigid man named Ferdinand Magellan. He was not charismatic, not flamboyant, not even especially liked. But he had something else, something steadier, a kind of inward certainty and a plan. A man between worlds. Magellan was born in Portugal, somewhere around 1480. The records are unclear. Much of his early life has been softened by myth and sharpened by rivalry. What is known is that he served in the Portuguese fleet during his youth, sailing to India and the fabled Spice Islands, gaining first-hand knowledge of routes and riches far beyond Europe. But ambition has a way of clashing with pride. After a dispute with the Portuguese crown, Magellan defected, offering his services to Spain instead. He proposed a bold voyage, to sail west, not east, to reach the Spice Islands, circumnavigating the globe. Spain, eager to challenge Portuguese dominance, accepted. And so Magellan became something rare and dangerous in his time, a man loyal not to a nation but to an idea. And that idea would cost him everything. The fleet and the fears. The expedition was made up of 5 ships, the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago. About 270 men joined the fleet, Spaniards, Portuguese, Italians, Germans, soldiers, sailors, servants, a mishmash of languages and loyalties, bound together only by the promise of spice and wealth. The ships were overloaded. Barrels of salted pork, hardtack, wine, vinegar, dried beans, and cheese filled the holds. They carried beads and bells for trade, gunpowder for persuasion, and the usual instruments of navigation. Astrolabes, cross-staffs, and, of course, the stars. They also carried priests and surgeons, and rats, always the rats. From the very start, the voyage was haunted by mistrust. Magellan, being Portuguese, was eyed with suspicion by the Spanish captains beneath him. There were whispers, accusations, quiet refusals to obey. The seeds of mutiny were planted early, and they never quite stopped growing. Still, the fleet sailed, south along the coast of Africa, then across the Atlantic to Brazil, and then, farther south, into lands unmapped and increasingly hostile. They were looking for a passage, a way through the bottom of the South American continent, what we now call the Strait of Magellan. But no one knew if such a thing existed. And the months wore on, mutiny in the cold. By the time they reached what is now Argentina, the weather had turned. Winds cut through wool like knives. The days were short, the nights were longer. Provisions grew stale and men grew restless. At a place they called Puerto San Julian, mutiny erupted. 3 of the 5 captains rose against Magellan. They accused him of tyranny, of secrecy, of leading them to their deaths. A night of violence followed, quiet by land mutiny standards but deadly on a ship. Magellan responded with cold precision. He executed one captain, marooned another, and took the others back under control. His message was clear. This was his voyage, and there would be no turning back. Still, the cold bit harder. The Santiago, sent ahead to scout, was wrecked by a storm. Winter locked them in place. Men grew thinner. Their clothes grew heavier with damp. Some carved dice from bone. Others whispered prayers to saints long ignored. When spring finally came, they sailed again, hugging the coast, until finally they found it. And now, as the echoes of sails and sea fade into the quiet of your mind, let us drift downward, below the waves, toward another story. One not of maps or mutiny, but of a shipwreck hidden beneath time and the strange, forgotten cargo it carried. Now, let us descend, beneath the surface of the sea where light weakens and motion slows, where salt no longer stings the skin, but instead whispers against timber and stone, where ships go when they are forgotten, and where history sometimes chooses to sleep. Tonight we visit one such ship, a vessel long buried beneath centuries of sand, coral, and silt, one whose discovery, quietly and without fanfare, changed what we thought we knew about global trade in the 1500s. There is no cannon fire here, no storm, no captain shouting orders, only the gentle hush of time and the cargo it chose to preserve. Let us begin, not underwater but on land, the unexpected discovery. In 2014, off the coast of Oman in the Arabian Sea, marine archaeologists working with a team from Portugal uncovered the remains of a shipwreck near Al Halaniya Island. Timbers, bronze fastenings, a few scattered artifacts, a broken bell. But as they sifted through the layered sands, slowly and methodically, more emerged. Porcelain peppercorns, gold coins, navigational instruments, fragments of a story. And then, in faint lettering, they saw a name, Esmeralda. The ship was part of a fleet commanded by none other than Vasco da Gama, the famed Portuguese explorer credited with finding a sea route to India. And more precisely, Esmeralda had been captained by Vicente Sodré, da Gama's maternal uncle, a man known less for exploration and more for ambition. What they had discovered was not just a shipwreck. It was the earliest known wreck from the European age of exploration ever to be found and excavated. The wreck and the weather. The Esmeralda was believed to have sunk in 1503, just a few years after Vasco da Gama's celebrated voyage around Africa to India. According to scattered records, the ship had broken from the fleet after a disagreement. Vicente Sodré, tasked with protecting Portuguese trade along the Indian coast, had instead sought personal gain. He moved into the Arabian Sea with his own agenda, seizing ships, enforcing monopolies, and enriching himself. But the sea is rarely patient with pride. Caught in a fierce storm while anchored off the island, the Esmeralda was dashed against the rocky coast. The crew, likely numbering several dozen, did not survive. Their bodies were never found. Time pressed downward, waves rolled endlessly above. And beneath, the wreck began to vanish, not in a dramatic plunge, but grain by grain. Scattered across the seafloor, reclaimed by coral, hidden beneath shifting sands, and then, centuries later, it rose again. The cargo that changed the story. What made the discovery truly remarkable wasn't just the ship's age. It was the contents. Among the finds were Chinese porcelain, specifically from the Ming dynasty. This alone was not unexpected. Porcelain was a prized commodity, but it helped to confirm the presence of active maritime trade routes between Asia and the Middle East far earlier than previously verified. There were also peppercorns, remarkably preserved. Once a luxury spice worth its weight in gold, the pepper had been intended for European markets. Their presence was a tangible reminder of why the voyage occurred at all, not for glory but for spice. But perhaps the most unusual discovery was a rare navigational instrument called an astrolabe, crafted of bronze and etched with the armillary sphere of Portugal's royal arms. It had likely belonged to the captain himself, and though corroded, it was still readable, still functional in its own quiet way. Its discovery marked the earliest known mariner's astrolabe ever recovered, a tool that had once measured the height of the sun at noon. Now resting in silence, its arc softened by centuries of stillness, it was, in its own way, a miracle of preservation, a return to the surface. As we rise now from the sea, imagine the wreck resting once again in stillness, unmoving, watching the currents pass, its story for so long forgotten, now part of the wider human narrative. And as we return to shore, let us turn our gaze to a different kind of voyage. One not made by ship, but by wealth, by gossip, by silk and gold and sugar and clove. Let us now step into the polished marble halls of the Portuguese elite, where explorers were heroes and fortunes were built on what others found and others lost. And we step ashore. The year is 1525. The sails have been furled, the hulls scrubbed. The docks of Lisbon smell not of fish or tar, but of clove, nutmeg, and cinnamon. The spices are unloaded in silence, measured by gloved hands and stern faces. The king will see them. The merchants will haggle over them. The nobles will wear them, not on their bodies, but in their influence. You are no longer among sailors. Here your feet touch stone, polished marble worn smooth by silken slippers. You've entered the royal court of Portugal, a place of calculated stillness, of low voices and high stakes. This is a world where wealth arrives by wind and water, but is spent in whispers. Lisbon, the hub of an empire. In the early 16th century, Lisbon was not merely a city, it was the heart of a growing global web. Caravels returned daily, sails frayed by tropical winds, carrying treasures from the coasts of Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and Brazil. Ivory, silks, peppercorns, sugar, emeralds. The riches came in waves, and Lisbon swelled with pride and paranoia in equal measure. Gold leaf adorned government halls. Tapestries from the east hung between tall windows, diffusing sunlight into a kind of soft, golden haze. Servants moved quietly, ministers moved with caution. The city had grown cosmopolitan. Moorish, Jewish, and Christian influences still lingered, though tensions brewed below the surface. Markets brimmed with goods from languages you couldn't read, faces you didn't recognize. A global city, even if its citizens still saw the world in narrow tiers, the court, the merchants, and everyone else. In the court, everything was measured, the way you bowed, the way you addressed the king, the order in which you entered a room. One step out of place, and your family might be gone from favor by morning. Even success could be dangerous. The price of glory. Explorers who returned from the Indies did not always enjoy their rewards. Many arrived broken, injured, sick, or psychologically adrift. They had seen too much, lost too many, returned with gold and spice, but also memories of storms, executions, and betrayal. Some were elevated to noble titles, given landed statues. Others, though, disappeared quietly. Because in Lisbon, power was not only earned, it was hoarded, challenged, and at times taken. A successful merchant might become a royal counselor. A failed expedition could result in prison, or worse. Accusations of heresy, of corruption, of treason were not uncommon. Some were true, most were convenient. Royal patronage was a delicate thing. To be summoned to court was an honor, unless it wasn't. And at the center of it all sat King Manuel Ver, and later João III, men who spoke softly, but moved entire fleets with a signature. Their power did not come from charisma. It came from control of trade, of knowledge and of narrative. And now the journey draws to a close. We have crossed oceans and centuries, from blistered decks and spoiled biscuits to wind-carved straits, to wreckage lost beneath coral. We've stood in the perfumed stillness of palaces, where fortunes were weighed and secrets whispered. The age of exploration is often remembered in songs and statues. But behind it all were ordinary men, sleep-deprived, hungry, and far from home. It was not glory they found, but grind, not riches, but risk. And tonight, as you rest, consider this. You sleep in a bed, in warmth, with clean water. With certainty, no creaking timbers, no salted meat, no wind-blown fate, only stillness. So drift now, away from Lisbon, away from the sea. Let the sails slacken. Let the tide carry you, and may sleep find you, as gently as starlight on calm waters. Good night.